Chancellor Rachel Reeves is tipped to raise taxes in the autumn budget. And on this week's BBC Question Time, the panel was asked whether Brits are currently paying enough in tax. Novara's very own Ash Sarkar let them have it.
There are two things in this country which are unfortunately really true. One is everything is too expensive, and the other is nothing works. And that's the picture of our public services, and I think that's why people feel so frustrated. And everything that you can see in politics, whether it's the Tories' collapse last year, the fact that this Labour government polls worse than a cold sore, that people are flocking to reform, that the Greens are racing up the polls, it's because of these two facts. Everything is too expensive and nothing works. And taxation is a part of that, but I'm going to come to that in a second. The first thing I actually want to talk about is where we're paying too much money. So £200 billion of our money has been paid out to shareholders for privatised utilities like rail and mail and energy and buses and stuff of that nature. That's money that could have gone into reducing customers' bills or investing in infrastructure. It hasn't. It's gone out in the form of shareholder profit. Or if you look at social care, which is really the monster under the bed whenever you look at any local authority's budget, the role of private equity is disgusting. So nearly a quarter of foster placements and children's residential homes are run by companies backed by private equity, and they're looking for profit margins of about 20% or more. So it's hugely expensive for local authorities, and that money isn't going into workers' wages, it's going into private equity. So the first thing we need to do is admit that privatisation has been a failed experiment, it has cost this country dearly, and it is an experiment that needs to end.
If looks could kill, my goodness, and Matthew Syed was giving her the side eye there. Former badminton champion, Matthew Syed. A really, really great intervention there about the failures of privatisation. A £200 billion transfer of wealth from the public realm to the private pockets of often very wealthy people. You know, I love this canard that you often hear. Well, I grew up in a council estate. I grew up in a council flat. It did me no harm. People are still living in council estates. It's now they pay £2,000 a month for the privilege because it's not publicly owned anymore. The buildings didn't, magically disappear and then we get new luxury flats in their place. It's the same building. I've lived in a council estate. It's just I was giving 60% of my earnings to have the roof over my head. That's one of the great cons with regards to privatisation or water. Privatised water companies in this country, when they were privatised in the early 1990s, not one penny of debt. Now they have tens of billions of debt. We've not had a reservoir built in the meantime, a single reservoir built in this country. And they paid out tens of billions in dividends. It's clearly a very obvious transfer of wealth. It's a con job. It's the biggest con job in this country's history. Let's go to Ash's second point, this time on where the tax burden needs to shift.
There are 50 families in the UK who have more wealth than 50% of this country combined. And half of billionaire wealth comes from inheritance, it comes from hoarding property, and it comes from finance. So we're not talking about businesses that employ people, we're not talking about socially productive uses of capital, we're talking about hoarding things. And it means that, as the lady in the front row was talking about, ordinary workers, but also small to medium businesses are getting muscled out. And then they're the ones who've been hit with things like the increase in national insurance contributions from employers.
But Ash, some of those billionaires will be companies, will be people who start up their own companies. There are some notable British people who've done that and made a small fortune doing it and employ lots of people.
Ash, what about them leaving the country?
So,
they're quite mobile, these rich
Matthew,
people.
I knew you were going to say that, and believe me, I have a response for you. So the first thing is that when you have a tendency towards monopoly, so fewer companies and they're bigger companies, they're kind of job eradicators because they're muscling those small to medium companies out of the way. The second thing is, will those billionaires leave? Some will, but where much of the bulk of this wealth is being hoarded in the form of property, they can't take the buildings with them. And so, God forbid, ordinary families get to buy some of those houses and they don't have to compete with billionaires anymore.
Interestingly, you could hear a "that's true" come from Times columnist Matthew Syed there. I think Ash won him over. Just a quick correction, by the way. You've been watching fake news here at Novara Media tonight. Matthew Syed, the Times journalist, Times columnist, is not a former badminton superstar. It was table tennis. My apologies. He represented this country at table tennis. Ping pong, as it's sometimes called. Here's what tax lawyer Dan Needle had to say. This is so dumb. This is so dumb. I kind of love what Trump's done to social media, right? A high-profile tax lawyer wouldn't have said that 5 years ago. There are under 200 billionaires in the UK. If they all sell their houses, the impact on the property market will be tiny. But why should they sell? They probably spend only a few months here now. If they become non-resident, they'll spend a bit less. Dan Needle, here's the thing. We can talk about billionaires. We should also talk about millionaires. I'm from Bournemouth. There's a guy, if you're from Bournemouth, you might have heard about him, called Dave Wells, who owns thousands of properties. He's a slum landlord. His bread and butter is doss houses. For people in a bad situation, and by the way, they're not going to get themselves out of the bad situation because they live in a dump and they pay a pretty large amount of money for it. Those 3,000 properties owned by one guy mean that entire neighborhoods in Bournemouth look like crap. They're never going to get better. Nobody wants to live there. Nobody wants to start a business there because they're slums. He's a slum landlord, closing the name. And if you really believe that getting on the property ladder or housing security is a necessary first step to being an active citizen engaged in public life, and I do, that can either be through social housing or owner occupancy, or you have really, really favorable rights for renters. I think you probably need all three. But that is a necessary prerequisite to being an active citizen, somebody who can contribute something. If you haven't got housing security, you're not going to be able to look out for other people. Impossible when you have somebody with 3,000 slum units, houses and flats. So if Dave Wells and his family leave the country because of concerns about taxes, no, they can't take those 3,000 homes with them. That's really good. That's a really good thing. You know what? There might not be shitholes anymore. We might be able to do them up. We might be able to make those areas a little bit nicer. Just a thought. Helena, who's right?
I mean, I have some sympathy with both sides of this discussion, really. Broadly, it is absolutely correct that you just cannot pick up properties and move them. And I fundamentally have always supported and I've always advocated for more wealth taxation, regardless of how that's applied, whether it's an annualized wealth tax, an immediate one-off wealth tax, whether it's done through taxing capital gains, or indeed what other people have floated, which is this idea of an annualized property tax. Ironically, I'm going to agree with both Kemi Badenoch and Rachel Reeves here, turn out for the books, by saying stamp duty is bad because it is taxing people who want to downsize and want to move to better properties. But we could replace it, as Rachel Reeves seems to want to do, with an annualized property tax, which could be put on these massive billionaire portfolios, right? And on the owners. Again, if you're a renter in these areas, your rent is set by supply and demand. It's not what the costs for the landlord are. And if you make it prohibitively expensive, especially if you can target your annualized property tax so that it is exponential the more properties that one person owns, then we can get the distribution of these things far more equitable. I think there's a really great point that Ash made at the start there, which is really important, which was about privatization. The reality, of course, is the necessity of wealth taxation, the necessity of doing these things that negatively impact wealth hoarders is a fundamental consequence of the fact that these things used to be in the public realm and were sold off, right? We shouldn't need to have the desire to take wealth away from people who hold existing wealth if it wasn't for the fact that they have gained this because what was previously part of the public realm has shifted into the private realm, right? Like the point very specifically that she made there about care homes is such an egregious manner. Like earlier on in that same debate, Helen Whately is the Conservative representative. She's the shadow DWP secretary. She was talking about how actually we don't need to raise more taxation. We need to cut spending and we're going to go after the disabled specifically, right? She specifically said that the disabled are the ones we want to take away money from. First of all, hilarious they're trying to do that after it was so bad for Labour in terms of how well that they polled. And second of all, it's just when you compare that to the amount of money that's being spent in private sector subcontraction for things like social care, there's a scandal in terms of children's care in this country run by private firms where they've been documented kind of abuse or neglect of children in these sectors because they have no incentive to deliver a good product. All they are doing there is taking profit out of it rather than providing a service which serves some kind of social utility, right? Helen Whately is explicitly saying, in terms of this argument, right, we should be taking money away from the disabled so that we can have more profits for the private equity firms, from the asset management firms that own our care services and ruin the lives of children who are in those services in this country. It's diabolical when you put that framing around the reality of what people talk about with public spending. And for all of those so-called patriots who are talking about like what's important about sticking up for this country, very few of them are talking about the fact that money is being taken from our pockets to look after our children and our elderly, and that's getting siphoned off into the pockets of shareholders for BlackRock and Vanguard and all of those asset management firms who are all registered offshore. That's money that's not just leaving our community, right? It's not just being put into the hands of the rich. It's put into the hands of the rich who don't even live here, who aren't even part of this country, don't even contribute to this country. All they do is suck. They suck and parasitically leech money out of our society because they own all the stuff that we should own. And whilst, of course, we should be taxing wealth, we should have a wealth tax, in my opinion. We should be trying to tax big assets like property, like big property portfolios far more heavily to try and discourage people from owning too much of this at one point, right? Fundamentally, this is all a downwind effect of the fact that we trusted so much the market and allowed it to be monopolized by the people who had the money to be able to, as Ash pointed out, muscle everybody else out of the market. Doesn't matter whether you're a small business, whether you're a previously publicly run company, or whether you're just a random person who's just trying to buy a house for your family. Every single sector of society who isn't a multimillionaire, who's not a billionaire, who's not an asset management firm, is competing with billionaires, millionaires, and asset management firms for those same resources. And they are getting shut out of being able to engage with that system because they will always outbid you, right? They will always be able to outbid people for those assets, especially ones which are central to the functioning of society, right? The whole reason why there was a bailout in 2008 after bankers essentially destroyed the housing sector by gambling on synthetic CDOs and mortgage-backed securities is because they knew that it didn't matter, because as soon as that all collapsed, they would get a bailout from the state because housing is central to where this government, so because housing is central to how the society can function because everyone needs a place to live. The market is not elastic in any sense of the word, right? So to be able to ensure that we have housing that's for people, we have a care sector that's for people, we have utilities that are for people, they need to be brought back into public ownership. It will save us money, it will keep money onshore as well, and it will ensure that we don't get the kind of scandal that we're seeing with what's happening with the shitty service that we do get from all of these privatized utilities. Because I would challenge people to name a single one, to name a single public utility that has improved since privatization. I'll wait.
The standard response is British Telecom, but that's just because we got the internet. That was a technological innovation. I agree with you, Helena. Isn't it interesting? 2 stories tonight. This one about privatization, the failures of privatization, and the first story with regards to Maccabi Tel Aviv. Just the things that our political class care about now are just so strange when you really break it down. You know, citizen, why do you have a problem with private equity owning 1/4 of children's nurseries in this country? Why on earth would you have a problem with that, citizen? Or citizen, why would you have a problem with violent, racist football hooligans being given carte blanche in the country's second largest city to run riot? Why on earth would you have a problem with that, citizen? It's like I'm living in a parallel reality sometimes.